This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
So, if I go back to the time of the population bomb, and it's stunning to me, that I have the opportunity to look back at something that Ann and I did 40 years ago, and when we've been at Stanford already a long time, and see what was right and what was wrong about it. And in fact, because this is the 40th anniversary year, a lot of outfits have asked me to look at it, talk about it, and so on and so forth. So I actually went back and reread the book, which is very painful. One of the things that always gets me is people come and say, what you predicted in the population bomb never came true. I got a secret for you. If I could predict things accurately all the time, I would have bought low, sold high, and would now be living with that wine on Bora Bora and not talking to you here. Any scientist who goes back and looks at anything they wrote 40 years ago and they find it's all correct, then you know you're in a truly dead, non-moving science. I look back at the first thing I discovered is that some of you may have been acquainted with the people. Every time Ann and I write anything technical, of course, we have it reviewed by all of our scientific friends. And the population bomb was, any of you remember Dick Holm? I'm just curious, in the biology department. There are a few people who remember Dick. But the person you might remember who once played a small role at Stanford is still around because I had lunch with him 2 days ago, is Don Kennedy. He read it for me. Peter Raven, any of you remember him? So a little bit of nostalgia here. But anyway, looking back at it, what's the major thing that was wrong with the book? Much too optimistic. The situation has gotten much grimmer than we expected. How can I say that? This is a book that several conservative websites list as being almost as terrible as John Galbraith's magnum opus, or I'm right up there with Karl Marx and with the Kinsey Report, and terrible books like Adam Smith's, all the really bad stuff. How can I say the book was too optimistic? Well, think about it for a minute. For example, when the population bomb was written, we wrote about the problem of climate change, but at that time, the scientific community didn't know whether or not, that we knew for sure that if you added crap to the atmosphere, the climate was going to change. But what we didn't know was whether the greenhouse gases or the crap that you put in that reflects energy would overwhelm, and there was a considerable debate in the scientific community about it, and we did write about the possibilities of taking a gondola to the Empire State Building, but at that time it looked like freezing was almost as probable. Why is that? Because Swaminathan and Ralph Cicerone and others hadn't begun to look at the other half of the greenhouse forcing. That is, in those days we thought CO2 was the whole story, but as you all know now, methane and chlorofluorocarbons and so on all play various roles in the radiation balance of Earth, and CO2 is only about half of it, and that moved the possible heating problem, or we prefer to call it, by the way, all the scientists I know are moving off of global warming, because global warming sounds too cozy. It's going to get warmer. What we're doing is disrupting the climate, and the evidence that came in after the population bomb was written is that it was clearly going to be warming, and of course the warming has come even faster than the IPCC predicted. So that was one reason we were too optimistic. Second one, there are a lot of them, but second one, maybe the most interesting is, and the one with the greatest lesson in it, was the ozone situation. Because when we do things that are technological, as I'll say probably if I have time in the last hour and a half or so of my talk, we do things that are technological to fix up problems. We always have to be very careful that we don't make more problems than we fix. And the most classic example is the substitution of freons for poisonous working fluids in refrigerators around 1930. That's where DuPont got its better things for better living through chemistry story. And as you all know, it wasn't until Sherry Rowland just happened to get curious about what was happening to the chlorofluorocarbons that Jim Lovelock was able to detect in the atmosphere by inventing a thing called electron capture apparatus. And if Sherry hadn't assigned his very bright postdoc, Mario Molina, to it, both of them got Nobel Prizes out of that assignment, we wouldn't have known that Sherry was absolutely correct. He told me that one day he came home from the lab, and his wife said, "Sherry, how's the work going?" And he says, "It's going great. I think I've discovered the end of the world." And in fact, he had. If we had not detected the fact that the ozone layer was being depleted, and it was quite a while after they first said this is what's likely to happen, that we actually showed that Solomon, oh my God, I can't remember. What's Solomon's first name, honey? Susan Solomon. She went down to the Antarctic, thrilled a lot of men down there because she was the only woman at that time who threw up, who showed up. She then threw up. She flew a U-2 through the ozone layer and actually tied it down to what was actually happening. But of course, if we hadn't detected that and the ozone layer had been depleted, it would have killed off all life on land, including us, although the scuba manufacturers would have had a great week or two towards the end. So that was a problem that all of us, everybody thought that freons were a wonderful technological solution to a nasty problem. And in fact, they almost finished our civilization and life on Earth's surface. Some of you may remember when Ann and I dated, we used to go out to roadhouses in Lawrence, Kansas, and the ladies' rooms and the men's rooms had ultraviolet sterilizers over the toilet. If some of you have seen them, well, that's what we're going to turn the whole surface of the Earth into by using freons in our refrigerators. So we were too optimistic because we didn't know about that. We wrote about the problems with novel diseases. And at that time, of course, the AIDS had not yet shown up. That's the first and far from the last of the major infectious diseases that are going to decimate humanity. But we knew it was coming. Biologists have known it was coming for a long time, just like we knew that putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere was going to warm the climate. We just didn't know what the counter was going to be. But we've learned a lot more about epidemic disease since then. And our behavior is wonderfully stupid. We have given up. We are getting out of the antibiotic business from our stupid behavior on how we prescribe them. And of course, we're basically defunding the agencies around the world that can help us watch out for the products of, for instance, ever more crowded China, with continuing to pond ducks and pigs together with people and generate novel flu strains. And the odds, of course, if you asked me, what's the likeliest thing to kill people that are in this room now besides old age? If they're going to be something, I would say probably an epidemic if we can dodge the nuclear war bullet. That's the thing. We're mostly rich. We're not going to starve to death when the climate changes dramatically. Lots of people will, but probably not people in this room. But the CDC is not properly funded. You've probably not heard a word about plans, for instance, for quarantining when the next nasty thing shows up. What are we going to do with international trade in a globalized situation when a really nasty flu like the 1918 one shows up? No plans at all. I doubt if most of our politicians even know about the threat. And the CDC doesn't have enough money, and most of the good people are leaving anyway. So that was a place where we were much too optimistic because nothing has happened there. Norman Myers hadn't shown what was happening to the tropical forests. We knew we were losing biodiversity, but we had no idea how serious the problem was until Norman and others started to look closely at it. So that was another place we were too optimistic. We were too pessimistic in only one real case, and that is I didn't know, and certainly the agricultural economists I read didn't know how rapidly the green revolution technology would be adopted, so that and also I didn't have any idea how much the propaganda that Ann and I and others were giving to it would cause the world to change its attitude towards large famines and change the way food is moved around. And so we missed the scale of large famines that we expected at that time, which is a very cheery result in one sense, but of course, as we and many others pointed out, the basic green revolution technology is extraordinarily dangerous in the long run, and we're going to see the results of that in the near future. In fact, we're already seeing those results, and I'll come back to that as I move away from the population bomb. The big lesson that I learned from the population bomb is never, ever, 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 when you're talking to the public, use scenarios. In the population bomb, we wrote a series of scenarios and said these are little stories to help you think about the future. They will never occur. They are not predictions. And of course, every time I go to a right-wing blog site, or a left-wing one, as a matter of fact, there are the scenario stories put out as if they were predictions and saying these predictions didn't come true, although in fact when I reread them, all the things we talk about are still gigantic threats today and getting closer. So that's a basic summary. The book served its purpose in the sense that it brought, which by the way, we were asked by Dave Brower to write it, who was then with the Sierra, top man at the Sierra Club, and Ian Ballantine, who invented the paperback book. And they wanted to inject the population issue into the building environmental issue, which had been started largely on the basis of Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. And so the book did accomplish that for a while, though the population issue disappeared fairly rapidly for reasons that we could go into if you want in the discussion. But I'd like to go on and talk about the dominant animal, which is basically a summary of the situation today. I started putting it together on the basis of a course that I teach at Stanford. One of the things, here we are at the greatest university in the world, and like, as far as I know, every other university, you can get all the way through Stanford without having the slightest clue about how the world works. In fact, knowing essentially nothing at all about science. You can wend your way through the curriculum and not learn a damn thing in those areas, which is at least half of our culture being defined as the non-genetic information which human beings have accumulated. And I think that's very, it's part of what I like to call the paradox of culture, in the sense that that's all right, that's the problem. Yeah, no. All right, we have two wonderful granddaughters who are just about to, soon we're going to be great-grandparents, not the slightest question. It's all right, bring them up to the front. I need the background music, come on. Where the hell was I? If you think about it, the paradox of culture. When I was a kid, the defining summer of my life, I spent living with the Inuit, with the Eskimos in northern Hudson Bay. And one of the things that's very obvious is that every person in that culture essentially knew the entire culture. The whole body of non-genetic information of the Inuit was in the possession of everybody who, I'm sorry, not to, I'm not broadcasting. Did you hear what I was saying back there? Yeah, okay. Men didn't use an ulu, a woman's knife, but they knew how to use it. They knew what it was. A woman could go out and stand over a seal hole with a spear in the ice and get a spear if she had to. She knew how it was done. And that was characteristic of us when we were hunters and gatherers, which of course we were, a small group animal for the vast majority of our history. It's only been in the last 10,000 years that's changed it all. And think about it today. Here we are, the highly educated group of people, almost everyone in the room, except for Ann and me, a graduate of the greatest university in the world, and we don't possess among us 1/1,000,000th of the non-genetic information possessed by our culture. It's absolutely stunning. For example, they're probably here, usually the example I give when I'm not talking to Stanford alumni, I've used computers since the IBM 650. It had biquinary indicators and looked very scientific and was the size of this room. But if somebody presented me with the parts for my Lenovo laptop, completely disassembled, and said, put it back together, I wouldn't have a clue where to start. How many of you could fly a 747? I'm a pilot, I'd probably crash it. There's more information in a 747, more cultural information than we have genetic information in all our DNA. And so there's a very dramatic change that's not much recognized in human society, in that as we have become dominant, as we have become more and more successful, we've also, each of us, lost touch with the vast majority of our culture. And yet there certainly are smaller areas of the culture where everybody on the planet ought to know, like how our behavior towards each other and our environment threatens us and our entire civilization. But that information isn't transmitted in most universities. It certainly isn't transmitted to everyone, because as I say, you can get all the way through any great university without knowing anything at all about science or what's happening in the world, and so it's very easy to do so. So I did, Ann and I put together a book that we will eventually use as the text for the course that I teach in human evolution and the environment. And it's basically a book to tell us where we came from, where we are, and where we're going. And it's been read by at least 50 of the best scientists, economists, and so on in the world. So it isn't just our view, it's a view that is very strongly supported by the scientific community. If you don't believe it, go to www.dominantanimal.org and click on more information, and you can see what the scientific community said now 15 years ago, roughly, about the situation, which is sort of summarized. If you want to know what's happening to our civilization, our life support systems, and so on, everybody, almost everybody in this audience has a little model at home. You go into the place called the bathroom, and you lift the lid on the porcelain thing on the floor, and then you reach for a little handle or button and push it, and then you look down in, and you can see what's happening to our civilization, our life support system. So we have this little mechanical educational model in everybody's house, which not enough attention is called to. All right, now, why should we know where we came from? Well, let me give you just one example. Looking at the human evolutionary history, one of the most important things that we did, and we don't understand all of it, by the way, but one of the most important things we did was after the dinosaurs got knocked off and gave us a chance, if it hadn't been for the K2 boundary event, I wouldn't be talking to you. Some velociraptor would be up here giving you a lecture. One of the things, we took to the bushes and trees and began to catch bugs with our fingers. And that had two interesting features. A, if we didn't have our fingers, we wouldn't have any culture. But B, it also rotated our eyes towards the front of the head and made us primarily sight animals. If, for example, you're jumping from branch to branch and trying to smell the next branch, natural selection is going to work against you. Much better to see the next branch. Try it the next time you're in a tree, if you don't believe me. So we became sight animals. Also, when we left Africa about 50,000 years ago, give a little, take a little, we were all dark-skinned. But we know that since then, skin colors have changed and changed back and changed dramatically all over the planet, because skin color is under strong selection in two different directions. You got to have enough solar radiation to be able to generate vitamin D, or you're going to run out of calcium. And you have to have a little enough solar radiation, so it's UVB again, to make sure that you don't destroy your folate system, which has other nasty consequences. And the balance between those two is quite delicate. So that even today, for instance, Pakistani immigrants to Scotland have trouble with vitamin D. How many have been to Australia? Yeah. Well, just think, here you have very light-skinned people moved in recently into a high solar radiation area, and if you look closely, you see most of them look sheared, not like sheep. There's a little piece of the ear going there, a little piece of the nose going there, and so cutting off the basal cells and the melanomas, and so on. So skin color has been changing continuously. Now, there was a person at Stanford some years ago who announced that people are color-coded for quality. Many of you may remember Professor Shockley. That is one of the things that's known by scientists technically to be totally 100% bullshit. But guess what? That could be a factor in a presidential election, believe it or not. I know you won't credit that. So knowing where you came from, what our basic sensory systems are, is very important. Knowing where we're going is even more important. As I say, I told you about the little model, but let me run down some of the issues that really frighten me and Ann and all of my colleagues. I've never seen remotely such distress. I mean, I just came back from a meeting in Sweden of ecologists and economists. We've been meeting for 20 years. The main economist you'll there is a Stanford that you'll know is Ken Arrow, who's a good friend of ours and we work with, but Partha Dasgupta, who is the president of the first the European and the British economic societies, and so on. Larry Goulder, often there from Stanford, who's chair of our economics department. And the thing that stuns everybody is the world is in this absolutely desperate shape that nobody understands. What did they do with my water if I run out of, it was on the podium and, oh, the red thing. You know, I was recently directed to go to the Y2E2 building and win the red doors. I'm colorblind. 8% of males are colorblind. You can't win. Anyway, and the fact that absolutely nothing is being done about any of them, basically, nothing at all. We haven't even heard any of the important issues, except secondarily the energy issue, which is only a secondary issue in the terms I'm going to describe it, totally out of the presidential campaign. It is gin. Thank you. I always get I mean, think of, to go to the campaign for a minute. What was the dumbest thing ever in the campaign, shared by both parties? The idea of taking gas taxes off so we can burn more oil. Now, that's like the idea that there's a problem in Europe that there are going to be too few young people to support the old people, therefore we ought to keep the population growing. It's a spherically senseless idea. In other words, you think in this day and age that gasoline should even be more cheaper than bottled water? When we already have a lot of our kids dying and many, many Iraqis dying in our attempt to follow the Carter Doctrine and get hold of Iraq's oil. If there's anybody in this room, by the way, who thinks that weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda, any of that stuff had anything significant to do with our invasion of Iraq, I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd like to sell you. Just see me in the lobby afterwards. I don't know. I mean, even Greenspan knew better. I mean, the plans for invading Iraq were put together something like 10 months before the 9/11 incident, and nobody from Iraq was involved in it. Absolutely insane. What we're doing is basically going out the equivalent of invading and drilling for cyanide to eat. In other words, if we did manage to damp down the coal, but just burned all the oil, pumpable oil we already have access to, we'd push the parts per million of CO2 way beyond 425 parts per million. And if you believe the top climate scientists, that essentially is the end of our civilization. Because it's not, global warming or global climate disruption isn't primarily a problem of sea level rise. Yeah, people in Shishmaref, Alaska and in Tuvalu already having to move because of sea level rise. With 50% of the human population within a few miles of coasts, it's going to be a fairly serious problem. But I absolutely guarantee the people in this room, 95%, that if sea level rise starts going faster, you'll still be able to outwalk it. What you won't be able to do, however, is eat if the climate disruption gets bad enough, because, of course, we've already probably entrained somewhere around 800 years of constant change in precipitation patterns. Now, that means our agriculture is going to be permanently under stress. The water problems, by the way, are not drinking water problems essentially ever. There's serious problems of pure drinking water in lots of countries, but the quantity problem is agriculture. That's where the vast majority of our water goes. In California, I think it's 92%, something in that region. And of course, we're utterly dependent in California for the snowpack in the Sierra. Otherwise, much of the water just runs out to sea during the winter when it's no good to agriculture at all. So we're going to be faced with changing the water handling infrastructure of the world continuously for almost a millennium, even if we manage to stop climate change right now, which we can't do. And that's going to be no trivial problem, particularly since I'm making the numbers up, but something like 40% of our food comes from the 17% of land that's irrigated, that has real infrastructure connected to it. Perhaps even more frightening is the fact that the Himalayan water tower is melting, all the glaciers of the Himalayas. 1.4 billion people are dependent on that water for their food. 1.4 billion nuclearly armed people are dependent on that for their food. And they're growing, what are their main crops? Rice and wheat. And guess what? Rice and wheat are already in those areas within a degree Celsius of the highest temperature at which they can produce grain. And on top of that, We're defunding the CIGIAR group, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the CIMMYT in Mexico, the Center for the Study of Wheat and Millet, I guess it is, and IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, just south of Manila. And we're talking about just millions of dollars. You know, one day's wasted money on fuel bombing people in Iraq or Afghanistan could take any one of those institutes and bring them up to where they ought to be. Single most important thing in activity we have is agriculture. Go all the way through Stanford and learn nothing at all about it. And the average person, and certainly the average politician, doesn't have a clue how the agricultural system works. It's illustrated beautifully by the fact that at one point we had something like 30,000 nuclear missiles pointed at the Soviet Union, and they had this equivalent number pointed back at us. This was the time we were doing the nuclear winter studies here at Stanford. And one night, John Holdren, who's maybe the top expert in the world on this, and I, sat down and did some quick calculations of how many Hiroshima-sized bombs, that's about 15 kilotons, a firecracker by today's standards, how many it would take to end the United States or the Soviet Union as a functioning entity at that time. Somebody like to guess?
100.
The numbers we came up with, which may not be exactly accurate, were 12 for the United States and 10 for Russia. And that's because people don't understand agriculture. All you got to do is hit the main transport systems, everybody else starves to death. And it turns out that the network in Russia had fewer nodes basically than here. So we needed fewer bombs to knock off Russia than vice versa. Everybody here still know that we have thousands pointed at Russia and vice versa at this very minute with their decayed command and control system, their inability to keep many of their submarines at sea and so on, everything on basically a launch on warning situation. It's probably more dangerous today. Your chances of dying in a nuclear holocaust today are almost certainly much higher than they were back in 1983 when we were doing those studies. Cheery news. If you look at the population situation, and I'm going to go quite rapidly through this, there is some cheer. That is, in no small part because of China's policies, but also because of development in Europe, there are places in the world where we're actually moving towards shrinkage. The current projections, and I have to give it to the UN, Ann and I have never made any projections. We've always used UN projections as filtered through the Population Reference Bureau because the UN is required to accept nonsensical stuff from any country that wants to give it to them. So the demographers do a job of cleaning up the UN statistics, but we always use the same source, and nobody has ever argued that source, of no political stripe ever argued that that source was not as correct as you can get. Presently, it looks like we'll add maybe 2.5 billion more people before growth stops. That's good in one way because it could have been 4.5 billion. 2.5 billion, of course, is 500 million more than were alive when Ann and I were born. Not trivial, but worse yet, of course, their impact is going to be vastly greater than the last 2.5 billion. And one of the reasons is we're the dominant animal. We got to be the dominant animal by being smart as hell. We're not smart about how we treat each other yet or how we treat the environment, but we're very clever. Just think, the original farmers didn't go to the most marginal land and start trying to add fertilizer to that and grow their food there. They didn't go to the most polluted water and try and use some technique, filtering or whatever, to make it clean. They didn't go to the 0.5% copper and start smelting it. Guess what they did? They went to the rich bottomlands. They went to the clearest, most accessible water. They went to the pure copper that was lying around on the surface. Now, of course, every person you add moves the energy requirements and the resource requirements and the environmental damage out another step. So it's not just like adding the last 2.5 billion, it's more like taking the last 2.5 billion and converting them into 5 billion more. And so that's not a happy part of our population situation. The happy part is that virtually every country with a semi-civilized and intelligent government has got a population policy now. The Chinese are the first to point out officially as a government that their population policy has helped with the flux of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. You can search the mass media in the United States till you're blue in the face and not get the news that when we had fought the Second World War with the largest population there's ever been an excuse for having alive at one time in the United States. Nobody's ever come up with a reason for having more than 140 million people alive in the United States at one time. Now we're going to shoot to 429 million by 2050. And more than tripling and more than doubling of the population. And of course, again, the greenhouse gas increases due to our crazed population growth in this country make us, among other things, the most overpopulated nation in the world. But guess what? We haven't had a government that's even looked at that. What we do is have a government that more or less likes to argue without knowing anything about the situation about migration, particularly about immigration, but with never a word about a population policy. It's like going to an airplane designer and saying, look, you design me an airplane to load 100 people a minute. And the designer says, well, how many is it to fly with? Don't worry about that. Just load it with 100 people a minute. We'll see what we can do about it. So the population situation is better than it might have been, but it's still very bad because nobody knows whether the environmental systems that support us can possibly survive the going through the peak of 9 or so billion people with the putative amounts of energy and so on that those people will require, and that's another story. The consumption problem is more complicated and more difficult than the population problem because fundamentally we understand how to deal with the population issue. And the major feature of it, of course, is educating women, making them as literate as men, which we still haven't done around the world. The greatest prejudice in the world, I'm convinced, still is against women. And it's particularly bad because it's not widely recognized. People don't realize it exists. But if you give women education, job opportunities, the capacity to control their own reproduction, birth rates come way down, and that's been shown repeatedly around the world. On the consumption thing, the politicians don't even recognize the problem. What happened with this most recent, get rid of all your regulations, steal the poor blind, and then, the system we have of capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich has never been clearer in the United States than in these days. And nobody, the excuse that W would give is go out, he actually did, go out and buy another SUV, go buy another refrigerator. In other words, consumption is viewed by idiots as a solution to our problems when actually it's a major portion of our problem. I got to tell you a story. Ken Arrow and Ann and I and Gretchen Daly and a bunch of the rest of us wrote an article called "Are We Consuming Too Much?" And we sent it to the top economic journal in the United States, the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And they accepted it, but we got back the word that one of the editors said, well, we got to accept this article from Ken Arrow and his communist friends. I'm one of the very few wine-drinking, airplane-flying Stanford faculty members who are communists, but we are a minority anyway. So we have huge problems with consumption. It's easy. And the economists are just starting to look at it. Larry Goulder's been involved with me at the chair of our econ department. But it looks simple at one level. Somebody here got $30 million burning a hole in their pocket at the moment. Raise your hand. Oh, good. Please give it to the attendant who will come right over and collect that from. If you have the choice with $30 million and the choice is then buy an executive jet or buy a Van Gogh, obviously the environmentally soundest thing to do is buy the Van Gogh, right? But it's when you get more and more towards the center, you have the problem of what is more environmentally sound. This comes in, for instance, with recycling and so on all the time. And worse yet, there are a lot of people in the world who need to consume more. In other words, it's the rich who are over-consuming, but there's maybe 1 billion people who can't function, who cannot actually help solve human problems because they're under or malnourished. Since the population bomb was written, we've lost between 5 and 10 million people a year to starvation. It hasn't been trivial. It just hasn't been localized except in some parts of Africa to hit the news. But the low level of starvation that goes on always, even some places in the United States on occasion, is just not really noticed. So we certainly have to look closely at the consumption problem. What are some of the other things we ought to look at? Because I want to wind up. One is much more care on what technologies we deploy. I hate to tell you, but the climate disruption, serious as it is and scared as everybody is about it, may not be the most serious environmental problem we face. One, of course, another one is the one I just discussed about the epidemiological environment. The loss of biodiversity is tied in to the climate change. That and land use change, both of which are serious, can't really be separated from climate change. But one that can be very largely is the toxification of the planet. We have been releasing a huge variety of toxic chemicals. They are spread, as hopefully you all know, from pole to pole. And when we're talking tens of thousands, probably 100 or 200,000 out there in significant quantities. Some of them are hormone mimics, which have what are called nonlinear dose response curves. That is, they mimic hormones, and they may be more effective in small quantities than large quantities because it depends on how your cells upregulate or downregulate in response to the chemical. We're already seeing frightening symptoms. You've probably all heard about the frogs with 3 legs, the alligators that are intersexes, the polar bears whose gonads have dropped off, and things like that. In subarctic villages, now in many places, there are twice as many female births as male births. These are not great signs. Now, on the climate issue, it looks like it may get away, but there are some crackpot ideas about what to do if it does get away, like putting sun shields between us and the sun. They're really stupid, but there are at least ideas and at least possibly technically feasible. I won't go into detail about what could be wrong with them, but the point is, on the toxics, let's suppose that a synergism, we haven't tested most of them on us directly. We haven't tested essentially any of them on the ecosystems that support our lives, but let's suppose that a synergism, not a 2-way one, a 3- or 4-way one, turns out is turning everybody on the planet infertile, totally infertile. What do we do about it? Do we get graduate students with forceps to go out and sort these molecules back out of the environment? You see, there's not even a crackpot idea about what to do if the toxic situation turns really toxic on us. Okay. Let me give a last little Pollyannish blurb about what we should do about these various problems. One of the things I think we have to do, and that's something we do here at Stanford, is try and educate people more about those little bits of our huge culture that you have to know about in order to make sensible decisions. In other words, when a politician gets up and says, we're going to drill for more oil, that's, as I said, exactly the equivalent of saying we're going to try and find more cyanide to eat. And they should be laughed out of the park instantly. Nothing like that should ever go on. And that's a issue of education. Another thing I think we need to do is spread our empathy a lot further. We discount too much both by distance and through time. And in fact, one of the things that's clearly wrong with the standard economic view of the world is expressed in funny places like the editorial pages, not the main newspaper of the Wall Street Journal, is that economists, unlike the average American, by the way, assume everybody's going to be richer continually through time. That's why they have high discount rates. Then we have to have some kind, and Don and Ann and I have been trying to organize this, actually talking to Scandinavian governments, which is really, really funny. For the last 8 years when I've traveled, I've told people I was Canadian to avoid the disgrace. But when you go to Canada and Scandinavia and the people know you can't get away with it. But anyway, talking about organizing a millennium assessment of human behavior, because all of my colleagues agree we know more than enough of the science to know where we're going. The issue is, why aren't we paying any attention to it? Why, when the scientific community en masse in 1993 said if we don't change our ways, we're screwed, why didn't it even get into the mass media, even when the Union of Concerned Scientists hired a PR firm to try and get the job done? So it's a behavioral issue, and it's a behavioral issue at several levels, but one of them is when you try and decide what kind of world we want to have, we're not all going to agree. Scientists can't tell you how to live. Do you prefer to have, if everybody in the world is going to have a Beverly Hills millionaire type lifestyle, then we're going to have a lot fewer people if it's going to be sustainable than if we're going to have what Gretchen Daly calls a battery chicken lifestyle. And so we've got to decide how we want to live. Then the scientific community can tell you how many people it might be possible to support at that level under different assumptions. But if you don't make those decisions, no way. We are, to end on a cheery note, the first global civilization, thanks to globalization over the last 300 years, it's not as recent as many people think, that is faced with a collapse. All the Tainter and Jared Diamond collapses, which we all know about, were local or regional. This is the first time a global civilization is facing collapse. And what kind of governance system do we have for the globe? We haven't really looked closely at it at all. Remember, states are recent. The nation state as we see them, they're only a couple hundred years old after the Habsburgs. You know, who says that our present kind of governance for the planet is sensible or right? I don't think so. I think that we as humanity have to somehow get together if we're going to save ourselves, save our civilization, and talk a lot about governance of the planet, because almost all our problems are serious ones, are basically planetary problems. And on that happy note, I will stop, and we have 15 minutes left for argument, counter-argument, and whatever. But thank you very much. You've been very patient. Can we turn up the lights on the audience and down here?
When will we become extinct?
When will we become extinct? You know, when we looked at the closest we thought we'd come was when we were looking at the nuclear winter issue. If you had a large-scale exchange of nuclear weapons with a number of weapons we had in those days, the climate change looked absolutely horrendous, but it still looked like in the southern hemisphere it would be possible for some groups to hold on, but nobody knew for sure. And the issue, you know, we're a highly social organism. The issue really is not decidable. We could drive ourselves to extinction. Obviously, we'll go extinct when the sun expands, but we got a few billion years to wait for that one. I'd much rather, in other words, if people say, well, we want to have lots of Americans, I say, yes, so do I, but I'd like to have 5 million years of the United States with 140 million people in it, not trying to cram 500 million in and have the whole thing go down the drain in 50 years. And I think that, you know, extinction is virtually certain sooner or later, but we could put it off a long, long way. And one of the things that's particularly interesting and frightening in a sense is if we had that large-scale nuclear winter scenario. By the way, it now looks like that was too optimistic. As you may have seen, the recent work by Toon and all indicates that just a relatively small exchange between India and Pakistan could essentially bring the war, not extinction, but bring the global economy and most of us down. But if we lose industrial civilization, it's gone. In other words, now, because I said, we didn't start pumping the petroleum from 2 miles down. We originally just put pointed sticks in the ground in Pennsylvania and got gushers. Now, if you're going to get petroleum, you got to drill down 2 miles. If you lose industrial civilization, you're not going to drill down 2 miles with a pointed stick going like this. And so if we lose it for long enough so that the information and the tools and all go away, then we're back to hunting and gathering on a permanent basis, at least until the planet's been around long enough to reconcentrate some of the resources. I wouldn't hold my breath. Yes?
In the context of, in this country and a lot of industrialized countries, we don't really talk about family planning or right-sizing a family. And in a world where American children, which become American adults, use more resources than anyone else. In this world today, and my wife and I haven't had kids yet, and we were talking about it. She comes from a family she has several adopted brothers, and we're trying to figure out the right family size. What is the morally right thing to do in terms of family size now, assuming you have the resources to have 1 to 4 to 5 kids? Everybody hear the question?
Yeah. Because I'll give this group, usually I just say stop at 2 because it's a politically useful way of looking at it. Because if you stop at 2, then you'll end up with the kind of family size that you get in countries like Italy and France and Poland and so on, about 1.5 kids on the average. The half, of course, gives you the opportunity for vice presidential candidates, but no politics in there, please. It's either party. But the answer I'd really like to give is, first of all, I think some people are really good at having kids and raising them, and other people really don't want them. And I'd like to see the society operate in a way that the average family size would be about 1.5 children, but that some people would be not harassed if they had none, and other people if they had 3 or 4. If people generally recognized they were terrific parents, fine, as long as the average hung around about 1.5. But how do you explain that to a general public? So stop at 2 is the motto I would give. Ann and I had 1. I would not have missed the fun and horrors of raising a child for anything. I think it's an incredibly interesting and important thing to do. I wish I'd had more time to enjoy watching my daughter grow up, but I was, after all, a graduate student and assistant professor, and all you got time to do is try and survive. But nonetheless, I think 1 is something to shoot for, and that at least gives you, you're certain you're not going to be taking more than your share of what the planet has, and at the same time, you're going to have the enjoyment of watching a kid grow up. And if you want more kids, a lot of them out there to adopt. A lot of kids need adoption. So that's where I go. But scientists aren't supposed to dictate morals. The issue is, how do you feel? And that's what people ought to talk about dividing up the goods of the planet. Whatever technological stage we're at, it's crystal clear that the more people you have, the less goodies there are going to be per person. It just doesn't, it's that simple. And so if you want to have 10 kids, then obviously you want to take more of the material of the planet than other people have the opportunity for. Stanford's a good example. I've always thought that, originally, I thought that the family side, the bonus for having kids, the tax bonus for each children, was a good idea, because if you didn't do that, poor children were going to be hurt. In other words, poor families that were fairly large, the kids were going to get hurt, not necessarily the parents, but they didn't have enough money, so you give them a tax break. And then the economists convinced me differently. They said, you shouldn't do that. What you want is smaller families, and if children are being hurt, you should directly help the children, but not which seems to me eminently sensible. So I think we ought to get off of why in hell should, for instance, if the Rockefellers send their kids to Stanford, I think they should pay the full cost of education. Not you got to remember that the tuition paid today or paid then does not pay the full cost of your education. That's why some of you may have been approached by Stanford for donations. I imagine that's even happened, possibly, yeah. And I've given money, and I give money to Stanford. But the point is that why should I, an underpaid university professor, subsidize the education of Rockefeller children or Kennedy children or whatever it is? In other words, it seems to me that we ought to have a society in which people who can afford it pay the full cost of the services they get. And that same thing can be applied to the tax system. So I can't see really, so I don't, all right.
You were going to mention something about the Green Revolution and the seeds for future destruction.
Well, the problem with the Green Revolution, what was wrong with the Green Revolution? And this is something that's not new. We all knew it. It was written about extensively. You don't want to plant huge areas of the planet with the same strains of crop, because you lose the genetic variability of the crops, which is what we base our success in mass agriculture on. In other words, the life, for instance, of a wheat strain in the northwest of the United States is generally about 8 years. And then you have to select a new strain because the wheat rusts, the fungi that attack them, will have gotten around the defenses of the strain you have. You got to get a new one. And so one of the problems is that the widespread planting of the same super strains, these are basically fertilizer-sensitive strains which require a lot of water, of maize and of wheat and of rice, was reducing the genetic variability available to the geneticists who are trying to keep the plants ahead of the plant's enemies. And this has led to huge problems, for instance, in rice agriculture with pests and so on. They're getting worse. It's one of the problems now with the increasing temperature, because we got to have a lot of genetic material to try and find strains that can grow at higher and higher temperatures, and that's not a simple task. Some of you may have heard about in Svalbard, in Norway, the cave that they've put into, Yeah, seed bank. Exactly. So Svalbard is the island it's on. I'm sorry, I'm mushing my words. But anyway, it's a seed bank in a very cold place. it's a good idea, but not a very good idea unless it's incredibly strongly supported. Because think about it, those of you who had my evolution course, what happens if you store seeds at very low temperatures for long periods? What's the selection pressure? It's for storage ability. Now, you don't, when you're selecting a crop, you don't want to select it for storage ability. You want to select it for yield, for a strong stem that holds the seed head up so it doesn't lodge, and so on and so forth. So at the very least, they should have a lot of money to continually plant out the strains in different conditions and so on. A much more sensible program, which would not be all that expensive, but it would be expensive, would be to subsidize farmers around the world so that some of them would grow less productive strains and keep them in business. Because those of you who follow this know that we've been losing not only crop strains, but domestic animals that are, strains of domestic animals at a very high rate. And that's extremely dangerous and something very, very difficult to deal with, which we're not at the moment dealing with it. So that's one of the other problems with the Green Revolution, which we saw and were expected, was that it was first of all, the so-called miracle grain strains, as I indicated, were ones that only created miracles if they were irrigated and highly fertilized. So guess what? It was the rich farmers that could bore down the wells to bring up the water and could afford the fertilizers. And so it caused social changes in the farming system. And it also prevented, not physically prevented, but prevented politically what I think and what a lot of my colleagues thought should happen, and that is that there should have been agricultural research stations established around the poor countries and the US and so on, to see to it, for instance, that native races of the various crops that were important were preserved and kept out in the fields and so on. We don't pay enough attention to agriculture, and it's humanity's most important activity, growing our food. Don't do that, everything else over. How many of you had some agriculture in your course at Stanford? Well, we got about 1% of the audience, maybe. Now, I'm not knocking Stanford. I do think we're the greatest university in the world, but it would be the same almost anywhere that wasn't a land-grant college. And so the most important single activity of human beings is not basically taught to every Stanford student. And you don't get it anywhere else. So that's why we had somebody in the computer science department that thought that milk was manufactured. Well, if you ask the average person on the street, not the average Stanford graduate, if you ask the average American where their food comes from, what are they going to say? The supermarket, right? Yeah. What happens before that? How many of you, by the way, have read Pollan's book? Everybody keeps saying it, but anyway, The Omnivore's Dilemma. I mean, it's something. He tells what all of us have known what the scientists have known for a long time. But if you want to know where your food comes from, that's the best source I can come up with.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to plan for the successful collapse of civilization?
You almost could be a shill, because that's a good last question, because we got to get out of here. But the question is, could we plan for the collapse of civilization? The successful collapse. Well, that's what I was that's even better. Because, you see, I think, the deregulation, the stealing, the now collapse of the financial markets and so on is an incredible opportunity. Because, you see, all of the plans are to get the same stupid system of continual growth, continual more production, continual more consumption, something that every scientist knows is not possible. Where the U.S. is already using about 25% of the resource flows on the planet, and we're 4.5% roughly of the people. This would be the time for the U.S. to set an example and saying, this was really stupid. We got a lot of greedy dopes who got in there. The neocons deregulated the system, which would have turned Adam Smith over in his grave, because they've only read a few lines of The Wealth of Nations and don't know a thing about the theory of borrowed sentiments. Say, now is the time to try and design a system that will keep the Americans we have now in reasonably good shape and keep the world going while we reduce our population and move to a sustainable society. It's an ideal opportunity to help people, to change the way we live, to talk about those things. I don't think there's one teeny little chance in hell that will happen, but that's what I think ought to happen. Thank you. You've been very patient and taught more out there.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.